every field has a specialized terminology. I don't know if you can hear, but there's a building site next door. Can you hear the power tools in the background, Ben?
Yeah, I can hear them, but I'm highly attuned to the sound of power tools at the moment.
Yeah.
We've got construction sites on 3 sides.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Ariane. All right. So coming back to the components of language, there is a specialized terminology for every field. And part of what you need to know is what those key terms are, and what they tell you are what are the components that create this field that you're studying. So linguistics is a field that has a huge number of new terms. And part of what you'll be doing is trying to bootstrap yourself as rapidly as possible into understanding what these different terms mean and which particular words and the underlying concepts for those words apply to the language technologies that we're interested in studying. One of the things I was doing when I was trying to find a simplified description, and I'm going to give you 3 years of linguistics in one slide. There's so much here that you could get into, but let's just go through a couple of these diagrams. And diagrams are a very useful way of putting different concepts in relation to each other. So if you think about when we speak, there are the speech sounds. Those sounds are the phonetics. And if you look at the ending, the phonetics, the phone, the sounds, it varies enormously. There are different sounds that different languages pick up as being meaningful or not meaningful. So in English, we make a distinction between a voiced sound and an unvoiced. So t, a T sound, and d, a D sound. The difference is the voicing. Now in English, that can make a difference between 2 different words. In other languages, that might not be a difference, but other languages have other distinctions. So in English, we don't make a distinction in meaning with the tone. We don't change words because of tone. Whereas if you're used to speaking Chinese, you would naturally be reading or be listening to the tone as part of the meaning of a language. Some some languages use louder and softer sounds. So if I talk about a word like grandma, and I said it in French, I would put equal emphasis on both syllables, grandma. If it's Japanese, they would be even length. But in English, we actually have stress. So it's grammar, syntax, morphology. Morphology is interesting because it's got 4 sounds, more-pho-lo-gy. And the mo and the lo are both louder, but the first one is the loudest of all. In other languages, you won't necessarily have that distinction. So the phonetics are all the different sounds. Phonology are the sounds that make a difference. So when a baby's born, they can hear every distinction in every language that's used in every language of speech in the world. But rapidly, over that first year of life, they pick up the distinctions that really make a difference in the language that they hear. So we're going from the general sounds to sounds that make a difference for the language. Morphology is the structural parts of the word. So the example here in the English word kindness is kind and ness. And these morphemes can be combined with other things. Kindly, unkind. You can take that morpheme and combine it with other components. So when we talk about morphology, we're trying to pull apart the structure. Okay, morphology. Syntax. How do we arrange words and phrases to make well-formed sentences? If we talk about child bites dog, that's very different in English than dog bites child. You would think, if you're an English speaker and you don't speak any other languages, you would think, well, isn't every language going to be like that? But actually, no. There are languages where the order of the words doesn't matter. And what you do is you put a marker on that word. So you put a marker on child to say this is the object or this is the subject. Okay, so how do we arrange the syntax? How do we arrange the words? And then grammar is the structure of a language. How the words come together to create sentences in the language. So we've gone from the sound through to the grammar, which is the whole structure of it. The syntax, so what's the ordering? Semantics, what's the meaning? And then pragmatics, what's the meaning in context? So the use of words as they are used in practice has a lot to do with the context in which they're used. Okay, so this gives us a set of words. The definitions here, we've also got the lexicon. So the vocab of words of a language. If you just have a list of all the words in a language, could you communicate in that language? And this is something that I think is really interesting from a language technology point of view. If you just took every word and tried to translate it, have a think about how well that would work. It wouldn't be natural speech. Because the way in which words are put together matters. You can't just translate a word into another language and expect it to have a meaning that is objective in the world that would be labeled the same way for every other person, for every other context, for every other language. So the lexicon is important, but it's not the whole story. So the corpus, and this is an interesting word, the plural is not corpuses, like porpoises. The plural is corpora, is a collection of the language recordings, not individual words, but the whole phrases, whole sentences. And the interesting thing about that is ideally with what we call metadata. So information about when the recording was made, who was involved, who spoke it. Optionally, you could have a transcription and a translation. What's the difference between, I know at least one person here will know these words in a different context. What's a transcription and what's a translation? If you're talking about genomes, what would it be? A lot of people confuse them.
Transcription is the reading of the DNA, whereas translation is when it's actually converted into proteins in terms of the biological context.
Thank you. Yeah, so it takes a bit in biology to really get, these two concepts are so radically different that no biologist would ever get them confused. But if you're not a biologist, we tend to confuse what they are. So people often confuse them in language when they first come into it. But if you've worked in speech recognition and people keep talking about translation, you look at them as if, what are you talking about? Okay, so transcription. Should I put Ben on the spot and ask him what transcription is?
I can't give you an answer from a genomics perspective. Transcription's depends on who you ask. Is it the tedium or is it the most exciting part of working with language? So it's the process of writing a text equivalent of some speech or sign, some non-text language communication or gesture. So yeah, it's a in itself, it's a translation. It really confuse things. So yeah, it's a changing form, changing one communication mode into another communication mode. And typically we transcribe speech by writing the words that people are saying.
So the reason why I think it's really important to hear that, and this is Ben's research work, it's what he's been doing for the last couple of years. It's also his PhD work. So what you've got is a sound stream, and you would like to chop it up into pieces. Now, in the language that you speak, it sounds to your ear like there's a gap between all the words, but there's not. The gap is put there by your brain, partitioning it up into words. So what transcription is taking that sound sequence, chopping it up into words, and then writing down just literally what that word was. And the sound, some sounds like two birds, TWO, would be the number 2, whereas if I'm going to university, it would be TO. It's a different word. So the transcription isn't just every sound has a given transcription. It's the sound in the context in which it is spoken has a given word that was intended. And so that's what transcription is. It's just literally knowing which words were said. So translation, we're a lot more familiar with. Translation is taking something from English to Punjabi, which I was experimenting with a couple of days ago to see how well the course materials would translate into another language and back. Translating from English to Chinese and back again. That actually works remarkably well. The concepts, if you put it into Google Translate, were working pretty well. I haven't tried Spanish. It would be interesting to know, or Hindi, or, you know, there's a whole lot of different languages, and trying to translate into sign and back again. I'm not sure that we've got any translation systems that are working in that space. And one of the things that Jess Court is working on is, and you'll hear about this later in the semester, is how do we actually get a translation system, a transcription system and a translation system that would be effective for Auslan. There are as many sign languages as there are different countries around the world. And so, sorry, I'm looking at the chat as we go, as many sign languages. And so if you're going to translate into a sign language, there's not just one sign language, like there's not just one Aboriginal language, or not just one ancient European language or ancient Chinese. Okay, so we've gone out through I call this the onion ring diagram. It's a very simple way of thinking about it. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. So the second one is sketched on a blackboard. So it's a fairly old diagram. And this is a linguist who was explaining to his class how you think about the relationship between these components. So there's the form of the words themselves, and then there's their meaning. So on the form side, we've got phonemes and phonology. So that's jumping in at this level here. So the phonology and phonemes are giving you the sound system, and then the morphology, the structure of the parts of the words, and then the syntax, how you put them together. We say kindness. We don't say ness kind. We say unkind. We don't say kind un. So how do you put them together? How do you put the words together to phrases? And then on the meaning side, actually, can I ask, if I move my mouse, can you see the mouse?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so on the meaning side, we've got the semantics, which is the literal meaning. And then we've got the pragmatics of the meaning and context. So one of the really interesting examples of pragmatics that our group's been studying, particularly working with older people and people living with dementia, is how a word or a phrase is used. The pauses actually mean a lot. So if I say, it's been 40 minutes, should we take a break? Let's go get some coffee. And Ben says, yeah, sure. Or Ben says, yeah, sure. The transcription of those two would be identical. The words are the same. The literal meaning is yes is affirmative. Sure is another way of doing the affirmative. But the pause, at least in this culture, makes a big difference between whether he actually means yes or he means no. In many cultures, one would automatically say yes if the person suggesting it was your boss. So your boss says, let's go to coffee, and you say yes. You might not even say yes. You might just jump in and say yes. But does that mean you want coffee? Well, that's irrelevant in the pragmatics if you think it's an instruction from your boss of something that you have to do. So pragmatics, we don't deal a lot in pragmatics in this course, just a little bit. It'll come in at various stages, but it's something that language technologists have to be particularly aware of. And one of the things that really is cutting edge at the moment is trying to understand the pauses as people speak and what those pauses mean. And they can mean many different things in many different cultures and in different contexts. And working with Dan Angus, who's one of the lecturers later in the semester, the Florence Project, which is another codal project, has been studying how many different kinds of pauses there are. And just with two speakers on a telephone conversation, Dan has estimated there are at least 72 different types of pauses that occur between speakers speaking. So the pragmatics, and that's just putting in a little bit of silence into what is otherwise speech. So we've taken a long time over this particular slide because this week, your job is to dive into as many of these words as possible, create a vocab for yourself, immerse yourself in them, and try and learn them as rapidly as possible. As a rule of thumb, you need to hear a word probably at least 6 times in 6 different contexts to be comfortable with actually knowing the meaning of it, and then start to use it yourself in sentences. So to convey these concepts so you can do this through your own writing in lots of different ways. And one of the questions for the quiz this week is to choose some words, doesn't have to be these ones, something to do with linguistics, and actually go find the meaning and dig into these. When I first started working with linguistics, I'm a computer scientist by background, and I didn't have this particular vocab. And I realized when I needed to work with linguists, if I wanted to understand the very basics of the conversation, I'd have to create a terminology. And in the space of 2 weeks, I created 24 different words, and then I just found definitions for myself and went through and learnt them. So Ben's put into the chat an overwhelming list of linguistic terms. So from SIL. And I think it's really worthwhile going into that in detail. Okay. A few other things that it's useful to know. When we talk about languages, we talk about the languages that are very widely spoken with a lot of different speakers. So we can talk about English. We can talk about Spanish, Chinese, Hindi. Then there are a lot of other languages. So how many languages are there in Australia? On the census, which is taken, there are well over 400. So I think a couple of years ago on the census, it was 450 languages were spoken at home. Over 100 of these would be Indigenous, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. What's the difference between a language and a dialect? And people think there's a definition. It'd be nice if there was. If this were engineering, we would define it and it would be true. But this is not engineering, this is real life. So there's an old joke that says a dialect is a language with an army and a navy. So what that means is there really isn't a clear distinction from a linguistic point of view between what is a dialect. So there are many different dialects of English. We talk about English, Australian English, American English. Did it matter? Not that much until we started doing speech to text, and suddenly people's accents mattered. The different ways in which words are used differs to some degree. So what's considered a language, what's considered a dialect is actually a social question, a cultural question, and it's a political question. So what you'll find in language is when a word has political and social implications, it will tend to have a neutral form, and then over time that neutral form might change. So the language itself changes over time. So language variety is a useful neutral umbrella term rather than talking about what is a language or what is a dialect. So we talk about 7,000 languages in the world, but depending on how you count it, you could say we have 7 billion unique language varieties. So every speaker has their own idiosyncratic ways of using the languages that they choose. And if you speak different languages, your grandparents might speak one language, your cousins might speak another, the people at work might speak another. You know that you're speaking different languages, but actually, even if you're only speaking one language, the language you will use with your children or a 3-year-old compared to the people at work or your friends compared to the language you might use with your grandparents will differ even for each individual. So we have idiosyncratic ways of using the languages. And we have vocabs and usages, phrases, different ways of communicating with different people in different groups. So thinking about multilingualism is something that I think is critical for this particular course. Okay, so we would like, as engineers, computer scientists, to say, what's the alphabet? What's the word list? Let's define what a word is. We've got this speech sound. We want to pull out the words and start by transcribing those. And then we can translate them if possible, perhaps in context of other words. So it's really critical that we have a technical answer to what is a word. The problem is, if you ask a linguist, the largest unit resistant to insertion of new constituents within its boundaries, or the smallest constituent that can be moved within a sentence without making the sentence ungrammatical. I don't know about you, but I would have to read that at least 3 times. And even then, I'm not quite sure that I grasp its meaning all in one go. It's actually a very specific, tight, discipline-specific, beautifully structured and really precise definition. But to an engineer, it's really hard to actually implement that. What is it? So when you talk to Dan Vanesh, computational linguist, a series of phones, so a series of sounds or characters with spaces on either side. So the phones are the sounds, sound sequences, and then characters with spaces on either side would be sorry, I just was looking at comment in the chat. That right-hand side definition doesn't sound like it'll work for CJK languages. CJK?
Chinese, Japanese, Korean.
Ah, sorry. Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. And there are polymorphic languages where you actually put all the different components together, and that it's probably not going to work either. So
maybe the software engineer that is being represented here may have only worked with languages that have a written form of left to right or right to left.
Yeah. So the field of linguistics has been strongly influenced by an American linguist, Chomsky. And Chomsky was famous for saying, if you studied English, you've studied all the languages. You know everything there is to know about language. I might be misrepresenting the sense of it, the actual words that he said. But it turns out that as you study languages, there are so many variations. There are variations in how we make distinctions between the different sounds. So some languages have clicks in them. Other languages, a click is actually not part of the words at all. Some languages are tonal. Some languages have stress. Sometimes the stress is used for emotional content. Sometimes the stress is used to change the meaning of the word. So what is a word? And as we jump into the actual language tech, it depends a lot on which language we're using and whether we can capture those distinctions in a way that makes sense for that technology. So if we try and get what is a word for every language, it may turn out that the very concept of a word only works for some subset of languages. And we have to think about some deeper concept or some other concepts for each of the different languages. All right, so let's look at the sound sequences. The phonemes are the smallest units of the sound system of a language that are distinctive. So things that make a difference. So when we write them, slash, P, slash, the actual sound is the phone. The representation of that sound is the phoneme, so the written form. Not all languages have written forms, but we're going to be dealing with, in the most of the course, we're dealing with the phonemes, the languages that do have phonemes, a phoneme structure. The phoneme inventory is a set of sounds in a given language which can be meaningfully distinguished. As I said, infants in every language can distinguish all the different sounds, all the different phoneme inventories of the world, but they rapidly become specialized to the languages that they hear. So allophones are the different ways that a phoneme can be spoken. So when I was making a difference between T and D, I was voicing it. There's another difference, which is aspiration. To aspirate is to breathe. So the aspirated T, if I say top, say it to yourself, the T has a little bit of a plosive air that goes with it. If you have a non-aspirated T, as in stop, the T doesn't have the aspirated form. Try and say stop doing an aspirated form, stop. It doesn't sound natural. But in some languages, aspirating top and dop, it almost sounds like a DOP in English if you don't aspirate it. So in English, aspiration doesn't change the meaning. In other languages, it might. So one of the things that I think is probably really useful is to think about the sounds, particularly of Aboriginal languages in Australia. So there is a video that you can watch to actually hear a discussion of the different sounds in Aboriginal English. Sorry, in Aboriginal languages. Okay, so when we talk about transcription, we're trying to write down what we're actually hearing. You can write down the word itself, or you can write down the sounds, and then the sounds can be put together to create the word. So you can actually have a phonemic transcription or a phonetic transcription. So you can write down the sound as it was spoken, or the phoneme that it corresponds to. And the standard way of doing that is the International Phonetic Alphabet, IPA. In this course, you don't need to learn IPA, but if you're going to be working in this field, it's useful to be familiar with it. So if we say a word like clean, the IPA version is given like this. So you've got the phonetic alphabet, so that's your phonemes, and then the phonetic transcriptions, the actual sounds of the language. So their acoustic properties, their articulatory properties. And the acoustic properties would be what is actually spoken, and then the grouping for a particular language will be the phonemic. So there are some references here to go into to see more detailed linguistic information. The more we understand about these particular structures, the better we're going to appreciate why language technologies takes the form it does. So there's a Miracles of Human Language and the SIL glossary, which you'll be looking up for the quiz this week. To get into morphemes in general, Lingthusiasm is a podcast, useful to follow up. Okay, so at this stage, typically we would drop into different rooms and discuss. I think we can probably do this as a group, as a whole. Think about 2 English words that are different only by one phoneme, so one sound. So choose 2 words, maybe 2 rhyming words or 2 words that start the same, finish differently. And try and pull out what is the phoneme that is the difference between them. So this is just trying to get you sensitive to word pairs, and then choose an English word and break it into morphemes. And I think now's a good time to I'd like to hear from the students in the class. If you would like, you can drop it into the chat or you can speak it out.